Simon & Schuster AudioWorks presents Star Trek Deep Space Nine, Emissary. Novelization by J.M. Dillard, based on the teleplay by Michael Piller. Story by Rick Berman and Michael Piller. Performed by Nana Visitor.
Ben Sisko's first encounter with Jean-Luc Picard shattered his life forever. On stardate 4400-2.3, a fleet of 40 Federation starships received orders to proceed to Wolf 359 to intercept a Borg vessel on its way to Earth. The Saratoga was the first to arrive. Lieutenant Commander Benjamin Sisko served as the Saratoga's first officer. Like the rest of the crew, Sisko had never seen a Borg, and knew little of the race save that Starfleet Command deemed them a grave threat. He knew that most who engaged them perished. Sisko was not afraid. He had absolute faith in himself, his captain, his ship, the fleet. But he had not been prepared for the size of the thing. On Saratoga's main bridge view screen, the Borg ship hung gray and motionless against a backdrop of stars, dwarfing the Federation vessel with its vastness. It was a huge, ungainly cube of spaceborne metal with thousands of tiny compartments, like a gigantic metal hive built by insects. Captain Storl leaned forward in his chair and frowned, a small, faint crease appearing between his dark, upswept brows. Sisko took note of the gesture. For the captain, it was the equivalent of a muttered curse. Storl was a Vulcan, dedicated to the repression of feeling and the pursuit of pure reason. The screen flickered and went dark. In place of the Borg ship, a face appeared. A human face. Jean-Luc Picard, the famous captain of the Enterprise, stood on the bridge of the Borg vessel. And yet, it was not Picard. Not human. Not machine, but a monstrous marriage of metal and flesh. One of Picard's arms had been extended with an intricate mechanical prosthesis. His eyes augmented with a sensor scope protruding from one temple. His pale face was frighteningly blank. His dignity, his warmth, were gone. If any part of Jean-Luc Picard remained, the man-machine hybrid gave no sign. The sensor scope flashed red, whirred softly and angled forward, studying the humans with an intelligence as empty and cold as space. I am Locutus. You will be assimilated. Resistance is futile. You will disarm all weapons and escort us to Sector 001. Sisko's lips parted, half in astonishment, half in outrage. Like hell we will. 001 was Earth. Captain Storl's gaze serenely affirmed Sisko's sentiment. Sisko stared down at his viewer and saw a schematic display of 3 starships gliding silently into formation around the Saratoga. The Gage, the Kyushu, and the Melbourne. Captain Storl then gave a series of orders. Move us to position Alpha, Ensign. Load all torpedo bays. Ready phasers. Picard's image disappeared abruptly and was replaced once more by the Borg ship. Rannoch, the Bolian tactical officer, moved pale blue hands over his console. The Borg ship is attempting to lock onto the Melbourne with its tractor beam. Captain Storl's attention did not waver from the screen. Target the origin point of that beam, Lieutenant. Fire when ready. Sisko watched the screen as Saratoga's phasers and torpedoes streaked through the void, flared briefly against the leaden surface of the Borg ship, then dimmed. Simultaneously, the Borg ship fired a bright, searing beam, striking the Melbourne. For an instant, the Melbourne trembled, illumined against the blackness by a deadly corona of light. Sisko squinted against the painful brightness on the screen, forced himself not to look away as the Melbourne's hull exploded into scorched, hurtling fragments. Forced himself not to think of those dead and dying on a bridge, very like the one he was on. A part of his mind screamed that they were all certainly about to die, that he should leave his post, find his wife and son, spend his last few seconds with them. But the rational part knew that Jennifer and Jake's best chance lay in his ability to perform his duty. The deck lurched. Sisko staggered, regained his footing as Lieutenant Rannoch called out from his console. "The Borg are attempting to lock onto us." Captain Storrell clutched the arms of his chair for balance. "Evasive maneuvers. Delta pattern." At the navigation console, Ensign Tamamota glanced down at her readout. "Captain, we're not moving. They've locked on." Sisko watched the screen as the gauge and the Kyushu opened fire on the Borg vessel, trying in vain to save the Saratoga, just as Saratoga had done for the Melbourne. Feverishly, Rannoch worked his console to maintain the Saratoga's shields, but with no effect. "Shields are going." The bridge went dark, and with a roar, erupted in flame. Sisko was slammed to the deck. When Saratoga righted herself, he drew in a lungful of smoke, coughed, and pushed himself to his knees. The bridge lay dark and smoldering, illumined only by the sparks raining from damaged consoles. Sisko strained to hear his captain's calm voice. Being a Vulcan and stronger than most of his crew, Storrell would be the first to recover, if he was alive. "Damage report!" No one answered. The emergency lights flickered once, then came on. Sisko pushed himself unsteadily to his feet. "Damage report!" In the dim light, Rannoch, wounded, bleeding, pulled himself up on his console, while Sisko moved quickly from body to warm body, feeling for pulses, finding none. Captain Storrell's unseeing eyes were staring serenely through the haze. Sisko drew his hand away from the Vulcan and rose slowly to face Lieutenant Rannoch, who hunched over his console in obvious pain. "Direct hit. Decks 1 through 4. Sisko knew that his wife Jennifer and son Jake were there. He touched his comm insignia. "Engineering, your status." There was no reply. Sisko and Rannoch exchanged grim looks. Suddenly, the computer's loud, overriding voice echoed on the silent, haze-filled bridge. "Warning. Damage to warp core. Containment failure in 4 minutes." Sisko hit his insignia again. "All hands, prepare to abandon ship." As he moved toward the lift, he kept thinking about Jennifer and Jake. Then he turned back. Rannoch was still huddled over the console. "Lieutenant, let's get the civilians to the escape pods." Rannoch nodded and followed. When the turbolift doors opened, Sisko felt heat on his face. He and Rannoch stepped onto the deck and staggered to the left. The deck was tilting, stabilizers were failing. Life support would be next. Sisko calmly reasoned that he would be able to make it to his quarters to see if Jennifer... Fire leapt at them from a side corridor, singeing the shoulder of Sisko's uniform. He grabbed Rannoch's arm, and together they fought their way past the flames, toward a frantic group of civilians struggling with armloads of personal possessions. Sisko shouted over the roar of flames, "Leave everything! Go to your assigned evacuation area, now!" Sisko continued on, passing other civilians, searching for 2 faces. "Warning, damage to warp core. Containment failure in 3 minutes." When he arrived at his quarters, the door was jammed open. Thick, dark smoke billowed out. Sisko stepped into it without hesitation. An explosion had ripped a large hole in the deck, allowing fire to leap up from the level below. His quarters, a lifetime of accumulated possessions, were destroyed. He pushed his way through scorched debris. "Jennifer!" He pushed aside smoldering fragments of furniture and twisted metal bulkheads, searching. At the edge of the largest pile of collapsed bulkhead and wreckage, he uncovered her hand, limp and smudged with soot from the smoke. He set to work with a strength and intensity that bordered on insanity. The edge of the bulkhead was jagged, sharp. His hands became bloody and blistered by the heated metal. Within seconds, he had uncovered Jennifer's twisted upper torso and discovered Jake's small, dark body beside her. She had shielded the child with her body and taken the brunt of the blow. He could see no blood, but in the darkness and the smoke, it was difficult to be sure. It's gonna be okay. I'll get you out of there. You're gonna be okay. He strained, letting the sharp, hot metal cut into his palms. But he could not lift the wreckage that crushed his wife's lower body. In desperation, he circled, cleared away more debris, found a way to reach underneath the wreckage and pull Jake free. The boy was unconscious and badly bruised, but breathing. The boy moved slightly in his grasp. Okay, Jake. We'll just get your mom now and get out of here. But Jennifer was pinned too tightly. Cisco was struggling to lift the wreckage again when Rannoch's silhouette appeared in the doorway. Commander, sir, we have to get to the escape pods. Cisco stopped pushing against the bulkhead and met the Bolian's startled gaze that focused on his charred, bloodied hands. Cisco stared down at them numbly. The only thing that mattered was Jennifer. Rannoch, just help me get her free. That's an order. The Bolian stared at him in mute horror. He reached down and scooped Jake up in his strong arms. She's gone, Commander. There's nothing we can do. Warning, damage to warp core. Containment failure in 2 minutes. Cisco shook his head. He knelt beside Jennifer and took her cool, limp hand in his bloody one. If she had to die, then he could not leave her to do so alone. You go ahead, Lieutenant. Take the boy. A security officer appeared in the doorway, and Rannoch handed the boy off to him, then grasped Cisco's arm and yanked him to his feet. Now, sir. No. I can't leave without her. Rannoch pulled with all his might. Powerless against the Bolian's greater strength, Cisco was propelled toward the door. Damn it! We can't leave her here! Rannoch replied by pushing him out the door. Cisco did not remember running through the burning corridors. Did not remember joining the dozen others in the cramped escape pod. Cisco remembered only 2 things. The sight of Jake, still unconscious in the security officer's arms, and the sight of the dying Saratoga as other tiny pods sailed free. Cisco made his way to the porthole and stared at the receding wreckage. Space was lit up like a summer sky with heat lightning. The Kyushu was gone now, and the gauge would be next. The Borg were right. Resistance was futile. All was destroyed. In his mind, he lay dead beside Jennifer, their bodies consumed by flame. He watched as Saratoga exploded like a small sun and let himself be blinded by the light. Three years after the incident at Wolf 359, Commander Benjamin Cisco stood in the soft grass, fondly watching his 12-year-old son. Under the shade of a large old oak, Jake sat fishing on a large rock, trousers rolled up to the knees, bare feet dangling in the water. Hey there, son. Jake turned at the sound of his father's voice, lips stretched in a reluctant grin. A shaft of sunlight pierced the branches and gleamed in his dark, curly hair. The smile so increased his resemblance to Jennifer that Cisco drew in a silent, painful breath as he crossed over and perched beside his son on the rock. Time had not dulled the memories of his wife. Cisco returned to the horrors of the Saratoga each night in dreams. At least, Jake was there each day to remind him of the good things that might otherwise be forgotten. Jennifer's same shy, crooked grin. Jennifer's gestures. Jennifer's good nature and complete inability to stay angry about anything for more than a full minute at a time. Jake was angry now, and like his mother, doing a miserable job of hiding it. How they biting? Jake shrugged and turned his attention to the red and white bobbing cork. "Small fry. Throw 'em back. Want to go for a swim?" "Don't have time, son. We gotta get ready." A sullen look came over the boy's face, and Cisco experienced a pang of guilt. "It won't be so bad, Jake. I've heard Bajor is a beautiful world." Beautiful, he thought, before the Cardassian conquerors departed, leaving massive destruction in their wake. "So why can't we live on the planet instead of some old space station?" "Well, it's what Starfleet decided." When Cisco heard that he had been assigned to the space station, he protested, to no avail. Starfleet obviously felt his career had stalled at Utopia Planitia, and so presented him with a challenge: Deep Space Nine. Cisco did not want a challenge. He no longer gave a damn whether his career stagnated or not. The promotion to full commander seemed meaningless. Before Jennifer's death, he had been unrelentingly ambitious, his career second in importance only to his family. But now, none of it mattered except Jake. Cisco was seriously considering leaving the fleet for the boy's sake. He'd even been looking into some civilian job possibilities on Earth. Thus far, none had panned out. Jake stared down at the water, at the reflection of the young, barefoot boy frowning back at him. "Dad, you promised we'd stay on shore duty." "The station is in orbit around Bajor, Jake. It'll be just like shore duty." "There be any kids there?" "Absolutely. Lots of kids." Cisco hoped like hell he was telling the truth. "Bridge to Cisco." Cisco straightened, touched his insignia. "Yes, Captain." "We're approaching Deep Space Nine, Commander. We'll be docking in 7 minutes. Cisco put an arm around his son's stiff shoulders. "Come on, Jake. We'll take the pond with us. Computer, end program." The yellow grid of the holodeck walls replaced the grass, water, trees. Jake slung the pole over his shoulder as they exited. He kept his sullen expression and avoided Cisco's eyes as they strode down the corridor, but at an observation window, he paused, wide-eyed with curiosity. Cisco followed his son's gaze. On the view screen, the space station hung amid the stars, the planet Bajor hovering nearby. A handful of ships were docked at the station, including one Cisco recognized as the Enterprise. Deep Space Nine had a gothically ornate alien beauty. The Cardassians were master architects, but their sweeping, angular style was dark and brooding. The metal had an almost organic look. It made him think of the Borg and Locutus, and from there, he was in his quarters aboard the Saratoga again, struggling vainly to free Jennifer's trapped, lifeless body. Then the scene aboard the Saratoga was obliterated by the sudden flash of an image. A strange, middle-aged woman reaching long, gentle fingers toward his face. All part of a forgotten dream from the night before. The woman's eyes were dark, unfathomably wise, full of peace and knowing and pain. The woman's face metamorphosed, grew younger, became Jennifer's face, and she spoke one word: "Welcome." Cisco tried to remember more of the dream, but could retrieve only the image of the woman and the light, and a strange sense of coming home. Jake looked questioningly at his father with a slight, curious, Jennifer-like frown. Cisco pulled himself from the strange reverie and patted his son on the shoulder. "Come on, Jake. Let's go." With Jake beside him, Cisco stepped inside the space station's airlock. Lying on his back on the floor was the Starfleet ensign. He apparently had removed a console panel and was reaching up inside to manually work the airlock controls. Ruddy-faced, sweating, he glanced over at Cisco and Jake. "Sorry about that, Commander. All the interlock servos in this airlock were stripped by the Cardassians. It's a junkyard, the bloody Cardies left us with, if you ask me." Cisco grunted his understanding as he surveyed the damage. Although he was not a man given to prejudice, Sisko was less than kindly disposed toward the Cardassian culture, which embraced treachery and vindictiveness. The door clanked shut. The ensign wriggled out from under the console and got to his feet. He extended his hand to Sisko. "Miles O'Brien, your Chief Operations Officer." Sisko nodded. "My son, Jake." O'Brien gave Jake a special smile, then turned back to Sisko. "Can I show you to your quarters, Commander?" Sisko nodded, hoping that the quarters were in better shape than the airlock. Jake stared glumly down the gloomy, deserted corridor, then looked at O'Brien. "Are there any kids here?" "Kids? Well, sure, some. I have a 2-year-old, but she's a little young for you. I think I've seen a Ferengi boy about your age, if he hasn't left with the others." Jake seemed clearly intrigued by the notion as a set of doors opened and O'Brien ushered them out. "The Promenade, or at least what remains of it. During their occupation, the Cardis sold commercial concessions to the highest bidder. Kept the mining crews entertained." Sisko saw that the place had obviously served as a combination free port and flea market, with a collection of kiosks, restaurants, gambling casinos, and bars. He suspected some of them housed sexual holosuites in their secluded upstairs. The Promenade even had a Bajoran temple. The place had no doubt been bustling during the Cardassian occupation, but now it appeared almost deserted and ravaged by vandals. Storefronts had been broken out, walls scorched from phaser blasts. Sisko had known something of the destruction inflicted on Bajor's surface. After a century of occupation, the Cardassians' intense mining operations had exhausted the planet's resources, and they had wearied of the decades-long struggle against Bajoran terrorists. They departed, but not without first poisoning the wells and scorching the ground, leaving behind a wasteland whose inhabitants were forced to turn to the Federation for help. O'Brien's expression was grim. "I'm told the Cardassians decided to have some fun the day they left. 4 Bajorans were killed trying to protect their shops." They passed by a bar and casino where 3 Ferengi were packing up equipment. Sisko thought of Jake, alone and forlorn, playing amid the rubble. "Why hasn't anybody cleaned this up? We've got all available personnel assigned to repairing primary systems, sir. The Cardassians took every component of value. We have virtually no defenses. Major Kira, the Bajoran attaché, and I decided..." Sisko cut him off. "Understood. But what about the civilians who operated these shops?" "A few are trying to rebuild, but most are packing up to leave." They walked in silence for a few moments. With each step, Sisko grew more apprehensive, more guilty over where he had brought Jake. Ahead of them, a Bajoran temple, simple and elegant compared to the surrounding Cardassian structures, caught Sisko's eye. As they approached, someone stirred in the arched, shadowed entryway. An elderly Bajoran monk, dressed in traditional robes, his eyes large and compelling beneath a thick fringe of white brow. "Welcome, Commander." Sisko hesitated. Welcome? He remembered the dream from the night before, the dream of the wise woman, and for the first time, he realized she had been alien, Bajoran. The monk wore a faint beatific smile. "Please enter. The prophets await you." Sisko flashed suddenly on a memory. The Saratoga's darkened bridge, the smell of smoke, struggling uselessly to raise the flaming bulkhead, the sight of Jennifer, motionless, trapped. He shook the memory off and looked at the monk. Another time, perhaps. The 3 continued past, and when they were barely in earshot, Sisko heard the monk say softly, knowingly, "Another time." O'Brien watched as father and son took a few tentative steps inside their new quarters. The room was typically Cardassian, all in shades of gray and black. The boy grew noticeably glum, and Sisko seemed to fare no better. O'Brien forced himself to smile. The boy wandered off into the adjacent bedroom. O'Brien took advantage of his absence to sidle alongside the commander and speak quietly. "Sir, I wouldn't allow the boy to go roaming. We're still having some security problems. Oh, and I almost forgot. Captain Picard wants to see you as soon as possible." Oddly, Sisko changed the subject swiftly, as if he hadn't registered O'Brien's statement. "Any word on our science and medical officers?" "They're expected tomorrow." Jake appeared in the doorway, thin, dark brows knitted together in disapproval. "Dad, I hate this place. We're just going to have to rough it until we get things up and running, Jake. I want you to stay here until I come back, okay?" Jake nodded in a manner that indicated it was definitely not okay. O'Brien and the new commander took the turbolift to Ops, the heart of the station. Sisko tilted his head back to take in the multi-tiered facility, where a handful of Bajorans and Starfleet personnel were already busily at work. O'Brien absently wiped beads of perspiration from his forehead. "Operations houses computer and life support, tactical controls, master communications, and the transporter pad. Obviously, we've got a bit of work to do." Commander Sisko nodded, still gazing up appreciatively at the different levels. O'Brien stretched out an arm and pointed at the metal grid mezzanine and a small balcony. "That's the prefix office up there. Major Kira has been using it." Sisko glanced around, searching. "The only office in Ops?" O'Brien gave an apologetic nod. Sisko exchanged an amused glance with him. "I guess it's time to meet Major Kira." Sisko made it up the rattling metal stairs in 2 swift steps. When he arrived at the top of the staircase and approached the office entrance, he heard a voice come booming through the walls.
"You're throwing it all away! All of you! Don't ask for my opinion next time!"
Sisko winced faintly at the sound of the terminal being switched off forcefully. He pressed the buzzer by the door and it slid open almost immediately. A Bajoran woman, her short auburn hair swinging forward against her cheeks, leaned aggressively forward in the doorway. Her large eyes narrowed at him. As she straightened, her hair swung back, revealing several silver ornaments in one ear. Decidedly non-regulation. "I'm Benjamin Sisko." She caught Sisko's gaze and returned his look with one that was a clear challenge. She stepped back to allow him passage, folded her arms, and scrutinized him coldly. "I'm Major Kira. I suppose you want the office." "Well, actually, I thought I'd say hello first, and then take the office. But we could do it in any order you'd like." She swept her arm back in welcome, but Sisko's momentary amusement faded. He'd be damned if he'd tolerate any unearned hostility. He folded his arms and looked directly, unflinchingly into her eyes. "Is something bothering you, Major?" "You don't want to ask me that, Commander, because I have a bad habit of telling the truth, even when people don't want to hear it." "Perhaps I want to hear it." Her anger eased briefly, then returned. "I don't believe the Federation has any business being here." Sisko nodded thoughtfully, reminding himself once again that he was probably leaving and none of this mattered to him anyway. "The Provisional Government disagrees with you, Major." She faced him with eyes full of mistrust. "The Provisional Government and I don't agree on a lot of things, which is probably why they've sent me to this God-forsaken place. Commander, I have been fighting for Bajoran independence since I was old enough to pick up a phaser. Finally, we drive out the Cardassians, and what do our new leaders do? Call up the Federation and invite them in. What sort of independence is that?" Sisko faced her squarely. "How can you make a comparison between the two? The Cardassians were invaders who ravaged your planet and your people. The Federation is only here to..." Kira interrupted. "Help us? Yes, I know. The Cardassians said the same thing 60 years ago. Major, when I was ordered here, I requested a Bajoran national as my first officer because Unlike the Cardassians, I believe the Bajora have the right to rule their own planet. I believe my request made sense. It still does. At least to me. When an alarm sounded on a nearby comm panel, Kira whirled toward it, pressed a control, then squinted at the schematic of the station that appeared on the monitor. The Major hit another control, and the map metamorphosed into the image of a humanoid, not Bajoran. Sisko thought something was wrong with the monitor. The man's features seemed slightly blurred, unfinished, almost two-dimensional. Palms flat on the console, Kira leaned toward the image. "Odo, are you reading something at A14? The man shook his head, and it was then Sisko realized Kira's monitor was in perfect working order. It was Odo's features that were blurred. "My security array has been down for 2 hours. I'll meet you there." Kira pushed herself up and strode toward the door. "We've been having a lot of break-ins lately. No need to come along, Commander." Sisko ignored her and followed. On A14, Nog peered around the doorway and squinted tiny golden eyes into the dimness. Nog was Ferengi, very young, and at the moment, very nervous. He was ashamed to be afraid. Not that the Ferengi race approved of courage. Uncle Quark always said that courage and honor and altruism were the worst sort of stupidity, and there was nothing worse by Ferengi standards than stupidity. It was fine to be afraid, so long as it didn't cause you to get caught. Nog was terribly afraid of being stupid and disappointing Uncle Quark once again. Behind him, huddled over a safe, Jaskal used the shield damper to neutralize the force field surrounding the safe. Nog turned in time to see Jaskal's huge paws scoop a handful of valuable mineral samples out of the open safe. Jaskal was a Bikazi, twice Nog's size, huge and ponderous and hideous by any standards, Ferengi or human. Nog disliked the Bikazi, but Jaskal could easily crush Nog into pulp and had indicated that he would most certainly do so if Nog did not watch his sharp little tongue. "Hurry up, Jaskal." With agonizing deliberateness, Jaskal dropped the mineral samples into the pouch, then at last turned and joined Nog at the door. Jaskal stopped abruptly. A humanoid was coming toward them across the promenade at top speed, the strange one called Odo. "All right, just stand where you are." Nog began to tremble. Of all the beings on the station, Odo frightened him the most. Nog stopped in his tracks, but Jaskal was not so amenable. He pulled a dagger from his waistband and hurled it. The weapon whipped through the air. In the millisecond it took for the knife to approach, Odo's torso became fluid, twisted, reshaped itself to move aside out of danger's way, then sprang back. The dagger embedded itself in the wall behind the security officer. Jaskal recovered, tried to charge past Odo before he had a chance to reform, but too late. Odo grabbed him, trying to contain him, until a phaser blast scorched the wall over the fighters' heads. Odo slowly released his hold on Jaskal and turned his unfinished, flattened features toward the new Starfleet officer. "Who the hell are you?" Major Kira answered him. "Odo. This is our new Starfleet commander." Completely unimpressed, Odo studied the new human. "I don't allow weapons on the promenade. That includes phasers." Sisko drew back at this and was about to reply when an older Ferengi approached. "Nog, what's going on?" Nog repressed a bleat of despair at the sound of Uncle Quark's voice. As Quark hurried toward the Starfleet officers surrounding his young nephew, the Ferengi was in anything but a charitable mood. He had been furious to learn that the Federation intended to occupy Bajor. Quark did not mind Bajorans. Although they were an odd people who filled their minds with mystical mumbo-jumbo, at least they left him alone to do his business. And he rather liked the Cardassians. True, they were treacherous and deceitful, but these were traits Quark greatly admired. He knew how to deal with the Cardassians in their straightforward cruelty, but the Federation, especially the humans, puzzled and irritated him no end. They utterly lacked any sort of common sense, as illustrated by their bizarre, silly notions of morality and honesty, which to Quark proved their stupidity. Then there was the matter of the overeager Nog, fouling up his assignment yet again. He had sent Jaskal along as insurance, since the boy could not be trusted to complete even the simplest task that called for stealth and deviousness. The priceless mineral samples would have more than compensated for the business loss and the cost of moving his operation. Yet despite his evil humor, he approached the Starfleet officers with an innocent, simpering demeanor. Quark turned his attention to the commander.
My name is Quark. I used to run the local gambling establishment. This is my brother's boy. Surely you can see that he has only a peripheral involvement in this. We're scheduled to depart tomorrow.
Sisko turned to Odo with a nod at the young Ferengi and Jaskal. That won't be possible. Take them to the brig. With an expression of pleasure, Odo led Nog and the hulking Bakazi away as Quark stared bitterly at the human. He released a sigh of disappointment and hurried on stumpy little legs to follow the prisoners. Kira watched them go and shook her head. Quark probably sent the two of them here to steal the ore samples in the first place. She turned to study the new commander. Sisko wore a thoughtful expression. Major, there's a Ferengi legal tradition. It's called plea bargaining. I might let the boy go, but I want something in exchange from Mr. Quark. Something very important. Kira was about to ask exactly what that something was when Sisko's communicator signaled.
O'Brien to Commander Sisko.
Go ahead, O'Brien.
Sir, the Enterprise has hailed us. Captain Picard is waiting to see you.
Sisko terminated the comlink and glanced at Kira. This won't take long. Kira tilted her head intrigued as Sisko headed toward the airlock. She had noticed the very subtle change in the commander's expression at the mention of Picard's name, and read the emotion hidden there. It was one Kira had learned as a child from the Cardassians, one with which she was all too familiar. Hatred. She stood watching for a few seconds after the door closed over him. This Starfleet commander was a far more complicated person than she had expected. As Sisko made his way to the Enterprise's main observation lounge, he reminded himself he had no right to harbor any hatred toward Picard. The human was not responsible for the crimes of the Borg. And yet, by the time he pressed the chime and heard Picard's voice bid him to come in, Sisko was blinded by rage. Captain Picard sat at the end of the table, reviewing information on a screen. He smiled and rose, extending a hand. Commander, come in. Welcome to Bajor. Sisko took the proffered hand. It's been a long time, Captain. Picard tilted his lean, sculpted face and studied Sisko. Have we met before? Yes, sir. We met in battle. I was on the Saratoga at Wolf 359. Picard's face went slack. The warmth fled his eyes. Then Picard banished the specters with a blink and gathered himself. When he spoke again, his voice was cool, infinitely remote. I assume you've been briefed on the political situation on Bajor. I've come to know the Bajora. I'm one of the strongest proponents for their entry into the Federation. Ben Sisko blinked to clear the afterimage of the past, forced himself to pay attention to the captain's words. Is it going to happen? Picard rose and moved over to the observation window, deliberately putting distance between himself and Sisko. Not easily. The ruling parties are at each other's throats. Factions that were united against the Cardassians have resumed old conflicts. Picard wheeled about to glance at him sharply. Your job is to do everything short of violating the Prime Directive to make sure they do enter the Federation. Sisko gave a short, defensive nod. He did not need his job explained to him. Captain Picard took a step toward him. Starfleet has made me aware of your objections to this assignment, Commander. I would think that after 3 years at the Utopia Planitia Yards, you'd be ready for a change. Sisko thought of Jake by himself in the dark, dismal Cardassian quarters. I have a son that I'm raising alone, Captain. This is hardly the ideal environment. Picard cut him off. Unfortunately, as Starfleet officers, we do not always have the luxury of serving in an ideal environment. Sisko did not back down. I realize that, sir, and I'm investigating the possibility of returning to Earth for civilian service. Perhaps, Commander, Starfleet Command should begin to consider a replacement for you. Sisko regarded Picard with veiled hostility. That's probably a good idea. Seconds passed as the two regarded each other. The coldness in Picard's eyes faded, replaced by muted pain. Sisko knew that the captain was struggling to find the right words to broach the subject of Wolf 359. Sisko rose abruptly. In the meantime, sir, I'll do the job I've been ordered to do to the best of my ability. Thank you for the briefing. He locked eyes with Picard and waited to be dismissed. Picard studied him for a long time, clearly not wishing to end the conversation. The captain detected a faint, fleeting glimmer of anguish in Sisko's eyes, and knew that Sisko saw the same in his own. At last, Picard spoke. The Enterprise is scheduled to depart for the Lapolis system tomorrow at 0500 hours after we offload 3 runabouts. Good luck, Commander. And dismissed. As the doors closed behind Ben Sisko, Jean-Luc Picard sank back into his seat, stared distractedly for a few seconds, then lifted his gaze to the planet Bajor. Nearly 2 years had passed since his last nightmare about the experience with the Borg. In fact, he had repressed his memories so successfully that, as he had studied Ben Sisko's service record before their meeting, he had ignored his slight unease at the mention of the Saratoga. How could he have forgotten? Failed to make the connection? He had been at Wolf 359 in full consciousness as Locutus, and as Picard. In their infinite disregard for suffering, the Borg did not do him the kindness of blotting out the consciousness that was Picard. He had been forced to experience it all, to hear himself speak as Locutus at the Borg's prompting. He had been unable to control his body, his voice, unable to hide his knowledge of Starfleet's strategy and weapons. Picard had been there, and had watched in horror as first the Melbourne was destroyed, and then the Saratoga, and the Kyushu, and the Gauge, and 36 other starships. How could he have forgotten the Saratoga? With a sudden chill, he recalled Sisko's mention of raising a son alone. Computer. Personal file on Benjamin Sisko, Commander. The name of his deceased wife and the cause of her death.
Jennifer Sisko, Lieutenant. Expired stardate 44002.3, aboard the Saratoga.
That will be sufficient. Picard stared grayly at the space station hub through the window. He drew a hand across his forehead. As Counselor Troy had reminded him gently 3 years ago, he could not change the facts of his mental violation by the Borg, could not bring Jennifer Sisko and all the others back from the dead. He had wrestled with some of the same demons as Sisko, had come very close to resigning his commission in an effort to retreat from past horrors. He hoped that Sisko managed to overcome those demons. Otherwise, Starfleet would lose one of her finest officers.